This was the way people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick explains, to them God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experienced reality which gave significance to their lives. Now, if this is the case, there's a danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract your attention from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible promises, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external proofs that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes an immediate reality in their lives. So in conclusion, if Dr. Cooke wants us to believe that God does not exist, he has to first tear down all of the 5 reasons that I presented, and then in their place erect a case of his own to prove that God does not exist. And unless and until he does that, I think that belief in God is the more rational worldview.
Phil Cooke to make his opening address.
It's a shame we're stuck with this very limiting either-or moot of is God a delusion, which runs the risk of quickly becoming a he said, she said squabble that will achieve little beyond widening the gaps between people. And I suppose that the people who thought this topic up just assumed that the atheist would agree and declare that belief in God is indeed a delusion. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint, but that's not the case. I'm with the great atheist thinker Charles Bradlaugh, who said, the atheist does not say there is no God. But, he says, I know not what you mean by God. I am without idea of God. The word God, to me, is a sound conveying no clear or distinct affirmation. In other words, the atheist has no reliable evidence that one person's notion of God is any more sound than the next person's. What Bradlaugh understood, and what so much contemporary scholarship has since confirmed, is that God is a human invention. So rather than talk about God as a delusion, I prefer to use Lloyd Gearing's idea that belief in God is a barrier. New Zealand's most influential theologian has outlined a series of barriers that must be overcome before Christianity can hope to avoid what he has called the spiritual schizophrenia of living in a world with a set of beliefs derived from 2 millennia ago, when the world was a very different and more primitive place. The barriers Gearing mentions are, 1, the false veil of sanctity and authority which has grown up around the Bible. 2, Christianity's claim to be the absolute and final truth. 3, persisting with discredited claims about the divinity of Jesus. And 4, failing to understand the nature of religious language, and in particular, the tendency to read Scripture literally. And the last barrier he speaks of is the traditional understanding of God as an objective being sitting up there in the sky somewhere. The sort of God that Dr. Craig has talked about. God, Gearing says, is an expressive term. It is not a descriptive one. Such an important point, that. What I'll be arguing tonight is that belief in the sort of God idea approved by Dr. Craig acts as a barrier to making progress as a religious person. Now, it should be apparent that belief in God can act as a barrier. In religious extremism and terrorism, we see belief in God providing a justification for hatred. And in environmental matters, belief in God can, and often does, act as a barrier to the sort of ecological awareness upon which the survival of our planet depends. This is because of the damaging anthropocentric conceit that religious belief encourages. In Dr. Craig's words, in the absence of God, it is difficult to see any reason to think that human beings are special. But maybe this presumption of being special is part of the problem. Another American Christian, Andrew Sandlin, not a religious extremist, writes, "The creation of humanity was God's crowning achievement. The animals, while possessing in some cases high degrees of sensation and intelligence, were not designed for this unique, everlasting communion with God." I mean, where do you start? Who the hell as a species do we think we are? Let's have a reality check here. We share with thousands of other species a hunk of rock, third one out, from one undistinguished sun and one ordinary section of one galaxy in, for all we know it, one universe among others. We now understand that the universe is anywhere around 15 billion years old and is the home to countless number of stars, somewhere in the billions. And in the history of this universe, human beings have occupied less than 0.00001% of it. In other words, for 99.9999% of the universe's history, human life did not exist. If humanity is God's crowning glory, why the need for so much time to elapse before putting the icing on the cake? During which time 99% of all species that ever existed have been allowed to become extinct. Now, answers to this question are straightforward if we think in evolutionary terms. But if we think in terms of Christian apologetics, they make no sense at all. I am simply not prepared to accord to myself or the species of which I am a part the lofty place in the universe that Christian apologetics requires of me. The single most valuable lesson that atheism can teach us is the moral one of not wrapping ourselves up in our self-declared importance and magnificence. Atheism reminds us of our complete and total irrelevance to the cosmos. Facing the consequences of this irrelevance is what Spinoza had in mind when he spoke of subspecie aeternitatis, or under the aspect of eternity. Under the aspect of an eternity that has no plan for us, doesn't care whether we get a car park, or a boob job, a promotion, or even true love or world peace. We can look at ourselves and others around us in a true spirit of humility. And with courage, we can make a life for ourselves and our loved ones and create our own meaning and our own purpose. And let us not suppose that this is a minority view, at odds with the religious majority of the world. When we examine the major belief systems of the world, we learn that belief in God is often not seen as being of central importance. The Asian traditions, which are philosophical ways of living, as much as they are religions, are more concerned with the elevation of the mind, with living in harmony with nature and with each other. At best, notions of God are seen as one way, among others, that this ideal can be realized. For most, notions of God are irrelevant, or, as I argue, a barrier to the elevation of the mind and living in harmony with nature. We should all know by now that believing something is no guarantee of behaving accordingly. Think of Graham Capel, former leader of the Christian Heritage Party, now serving 9 years for the sexual exploitation of children. It's only the Judeo-Christian religions which place belief in God as central to their systems. But with this emphasis on belief in God has come its tragic corollary of making a fetish of the us versus them distinction. As century followed century, believers in God have murdered unbelievers and each other, all in the name of a supposedly perfect and all-loving God. Nowhere is the truth that God is a human invention better illustrated than in the Hebrew Bible. what rudely gets called the Old Testament.